All right, well, welcome everybody to the first deep dive that we're going to go into over Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 11. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to go through Genesis chapter 1 through 3. This is an optional piece of the small group curriculum that we're going through right now for the invitation season. But if you find this video online and you're not a part of a 514 Church small group, or you're not even a part of 514 Church, but you're interested in this topic, because this is a topic, Genesis chapter 1 through 3, that a lot of people are very interested in, very important in terms of the biblical story. And so whether you're a part of the small groups at this church community or not, feel free to take a look at this video and just kind of see what's going on. The reason that we're doing these deep dives is because when you think about something that's as complex as a biblical story or things that are happening in the Bible, in your small group time, there may not be enough time to really dig into some of the nuance of it, some of the things contextually or linguistically that make it exciting, that make it so cool, that make it something that is so beautiful to read when you understand. And so we just want to give some space for people if they want to dive a little bit deeper into the story. And so the reason that we're doing Genesis chapters 1 through 11 for this part is because we hear over and over from people that one of the reasons they don't feel comfortable sharing their faith with other people, one of the reasons they don't feel comfortable inviting people into their faith world in terms of being a Christian is because they don't really feel equipped to do so. They don't really feel like they know enough. The Bible is a very confusing, sometimes very strange thing to read and to try to interpret. And so they don't really feel like they're able to share that with people. If they don't understand it themselves, they don't really understand how they're supposed to share it with people. And that's absolutely true. The Bible is a very strange document to read, and so I have tons of sympathy for that. But I actually think that one of the problems that people have with understanding the scriptures is actually a very simple problem. And the problem is that people don't know exactly what the Bible is supposed to be. For a lot of people, they think that the Bible is kind of a rule book, a divinely commanded rule book from God. There's these rules of what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. And if you believe in God, you're supposed to follow those rules, and those rules are found in the Bible. For some people, it's more of a devotional grab bag type thing where, you're going in your week, you need some motivation, you need some inspiration, Romans 8:28. And you pull that verse out of Romans and it applies to your life and it helps you. For some other people, it's about how to go to heaven when you die. A lot of people have this idea about the Christian faith that it's all about, you live this life, and the point is that when you die, you're either going to go to the good place or you're going to go to the bad place. And that's really the important thing. And the Bible kind of teaches us how to do that. And there's a kernel of truth in all of those scenarios. The problem is that those are not foundationally what the Bible is. And so when you treat it like that, it's just kind of this incomplete, reduced understanding of this beautiful gift that God has given us, which is his revelation. And foundationally, what the Bible actually is it's a story. It's a story of redemptive history. It's a story of God. It's a story of humans. It's a story of the world and creation and where all of that is going. God does not just say things, God does things. And so the Bible is a story about what God is up to. And the reason it's important to understand the story is because we then get invited into that story right here, right now, in order to participate, and in order to participate in what Jesus calls the kingdom of God. And that's a beautiful thing. Once you start to understand the biblical storyline, the entire narrative, and I say it's a story because Genesis 1, chapter 1 says, in the beginning, ... and then there's thousands of pages and thousands of years. And then Revelation chapter 22, verse 5 says, and they will reign forever and ever. So it's like a story. It's like a narrative, like you read in novels. And once you start to understand that, a lot of things start to make a lot more sense. It's kind of the contextual framework from which you then interpret all the pieces and parts. Open to the book of Judges and just read it without understanding the story of the Bible. It's very, very strange. It's very confusing. But once you understand the meta narrative, the big picture narrative, then you open to something like Judges or something like Isaiah, and it makes so much more sense. Some of the things that are confusing about Paul's letters make so much more sense when you understand that fits within a broader narrative. So once you start to understand the storyline of the Bible, you start to understand the Bible in a way that a lot of people don't. And it becomes something that you not only start to see the beauty in it, but you start to get comfortable with it. And so the way that we teach the scriptures here at this church, in this community, is you have to understand the story. And first you have to zoom out before you can zoom in. And so you understand the storyline of the Bible. And that's why we want to start in Genesis chapter 1, because any other story that you engage with, you have to start at the beginning. If you read a novel, you wouldn't start in the middle. If you were watching a movie, which is a story, you wouldn't start halfway through. You need to start at the beginning. That's where the foundations are set. That's usually where the conflict that has to be resolved is set. That's where the understanding happens. And so for me, Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 11 is one of the most important parts of the Bible to understand. Not only is it the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful, but it's also one of the most important if you want to understand the main plot line, the narrative structure of God's revelation through Scripture. And so we're going to start at the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And just to kind of pique your interest a little bit in terms of how meaningful some of this stuff is. And we're not really going to get into it during these deep dives or throughout this curriculum, but I just want to kind of show you some things that are very interesting. The first thing is, where does Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 take place? In a garden. In John chapter 21, the resurrection story, where does Jesus first reveal himself resurrected to Mary Magdalene? In a garden. In Genesis chapter 2, which we'll get into here, Adam is given the divine command from God to work and keep the land, which is essentially like a gardening mandate, to be a gardener in the Garden of Eden, to cultivate the land, to make it better. When Jesus reveals himself to Mary and John, she doesn't recognize him at first. And who does she think that he is? She thinks he's a gardener. That's what the text says. So there's something there, right? In Luke, there's a story of the criminal on the cross. And Jesus is up on the cross, and there's two criminals next to him, and one of the criminals is disparaging towards Jesus, and then one of the criminals puts their faith in Jesus, and he says to the criminal the famous line, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And the word paradise is a Greek word, paradiso, and at the time of Jesus's revelation, when he was in his ministry and the cross and the resurrection, the most common way that the Jewish people read the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, was the Greek translation. It's originally written in Hebrew, but the rabbis translated it into Greek because that was one of the most common languages to read. And so the authoritative translation of the Old Testament is called the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. And in the Greek translation of Genesis chapter 1, guess what the word for garden is? It's the same word, paradiso. And so today you will be with me in the garden is another way that you can look at that. And so to understand Jesus, you have to understand Genesis, to understand how Jesus completes the plot line of the Bible, how he is the climactic resolution of the whole biblical story. You have to understand Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And today we're going to go through 1 through 3. And this is some of the most important stuff that you could possibly imagine in terms of understanding the story. Now, before we get into the text, the first thing that we have to talk about is essentially what I'll call the creation controversy. And the reason that this is important is because for a lot of people, the only interaction that they've ever had with the creation story is through the controversy of whether or not this is the actual way that God materially created the world. Is this the scientific account of the material creation of the world. And there's been lots of debate about this. In the 15, 16, 1700s, post-Enlightenment, that idea was attacked by some of these technological and scientific advances, and we learned some things about the age of the earth. And so there's a big controversy about how did this actually come to be? What is this account saying? And like I said, for many people, this is your only interaction with this text, is this controversy. And my opinion is that controversy has entirely hijacked what is actually most important about this story. One of the things that you have to remember is that this is a very, very ancient document, and it should be treated as such. There's kind of a cultural inappropriateness if you were to get on a plane and fly to a beautiful country like France as an American, and you get off the plane and you hear people speaking French and you get mad that they're speaking French. You're like, why would you not be speaking English? And it's like, well, because this is France and this is their culture. Whose responsibility is it to understand and adapt? Is it their, as a country, responsibility to adapt and change for you, the American tourist? Or is it your responsibility to understand that this is a different culture that speaks a different language, and to embrace that and to try to lean into that and learn and familiarize yourself so that you can understand the beauty of that? And the same thing is kind of true of the Bible. It's a cross-cultural experience. These stories are 2,000, 4,000 years old in terms of when it was written down. In terms of the oral tradition, we don't know how old these stories are. We don't know how old these stories are. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The understanding that we have of modern science is hundreds of years old, 200, 300 years old. When you think about Newtonian physics and then how that has kind of changed and transformed into the way that we understand the world now, it's very, very recent. And so it's kind of a ridiculous thing to expect the author of Genesis chapter 1 in a story whose oral tradition is too old for us to even understand or calculate, for us to expect that author to speak in a scientific manner in the way that you or I would in our context after all of these revolutions of science. And so we have to be sensitive to that, and we have to read the Bible for what it is, which is an ancient document. And all of that leads to my point of, whether or not this is the historical material creation of the world, the actual phenomenon of how the world was created materially and scientifically, it actually, that's not the point. It doesn't matter. And that might be hard to hear, because for some people, that is their only interaction with this text. But in my opinion, that's not what it's about. That's not what the author is getting at. This is not a scientific account of the world. Now, is this how the world was created? Maybe it was. Is evolution true? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Honestly, in terms of my education, I don't have the educational chops in that world to be able to speak to that. What I can speak to is that the contextual reality of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the creation stories, is a theological construction. The author wants us to understand how God has revealed to him what kind of world we live in. Who is God? Who are we? What is creation? What does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a part of God's world? Some of these questions about purpose and identity, this is where it starts. This is how we understand the theological reality of humanity and God. When you look around at the world and you see this can't be how things are supposed to be. When you look at the violence and you look at the death and you look at the way that we interact with each other, it's not the way the world is supposed to be. Where does that come from? Why is that true? These are all questions that the Genesis account is very, very interested in. In fact, I would argue is exclusively interested in answering and painting for us. And so that's what we're going to focus on. If you ever want to, sit down with me and have a conversation about the controversy of old earth, new earth, evolution, theistic evolution, all that stuff, I would be happy to do so. That's just not what the text is about. And so we need to focus on what the text is about. And that's really what we're going to talk about here. And so we start in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." And so the story opens, and something is already there. There's an earth, but it's without form and void, or maybe your translation says formless and void. And this is really important. God is hovering over a formless and void earth that's covered in waters. And the Hebrew word for formless and void, or without form and void, is actually a kind of a poetic word construction that rhymes, and it's tohu vavohu, which means wild and waste, or disordered, chaotic, and empty. And so when you look at the story, that's where it begins. God is hovering over a tohu vavohu creation, a creation that is without form and void, a creation that is chaotic and disordered and empty. And because of its chaotic nature, it's not a place for life to flourish. And so you read through the story. And what does God start to do to this chaotic and empty world? He starts to, on the one hand, organize it, pull out of it order and beauty and goodness. And on the other hand, he starts to fill it, right? Because it's tohu vavohu. It's disorganized and chaotic, and it's empty. And so the story of Genesis chapter 1 is actually God organizing the tohu, organizing the disordered nature of the world, and then filling the vohu, filling the emptiness. And you read through the story, and you know, you start to see that, because he organizes it. He separates the light from the dark. That's order. He separates the waters above from the waters below, so that there's a space for creatures to dwell. That's order. He separates the dry land from the waters and creates seasons. You know, that's all an organizing, ordered process. God is ordering the disorderedness. He's ordering the tohu. And then as you move on in the days, you know, then what does he do? He takes those ordered spaces and he fills them, right? He puts lights in the sky, it says. He fills the skies with lights. He puts fish in the water and birds in the sky above the water. And then he puts animals on the land. And so by the end, you know, Genesis chapter 1, or Genesis 1:25, God has taken a tohu vavohu world, and he's ordered it, and he's filled it. He's taken order and beauty and goodness. He's cultivated, he's pulled it out of the chaos and the darkness, and he's filled it with life. And now this disorganized, chaotic world where life is not meant to flourish is now a place where life can flourish. And every time God does one of those things, either organize or fill, he says it's good. God saw that it was good. This tohu vavohu world is being organized and ordered and filled, and it is now a place where life is able to not only exist, but flourish and prosper. And then the end of the sixth day, it says that God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish in the sea, and the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them, and God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And then at the end, 131, "And God saw all that he had created, and behold, it was very good." That was the end of the sixth day. And so at the end, kind of his crowning achievement of his creation, of organizing and ordering and filling, he creates humans, and he calls us images of God. Image of God. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And so there's this diverse humanity, male and female, that together create the image of God. And that word in Hebrew, image, is the Hebrew word tselem. And when you read the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the rest of the Old Testament, tselem is used to describe actual idols, carvings of wood and metal that represented gods. And in the Ten Commandments, God says, "You shall not make idols after me." And one of the reasons you're not supposed to make idols after God is because he already made them. He already made these representations. And it's you and it's me. It's humans. Humanity is the representations of the very God that we worship. Now think about the implications of this. What this means for us. As C.S. Lewis said, until we come face to face with God, your neighbor, the person you see looking back in the mirror at you, the person sitting next to you on the bus, is the closest thing that we will ever see to looking into the face of God. That's an image. That's a representation of the very God that we worship. Imagine how we should conduct ourselves in a world full of images of God, in a world full of these beings that actually represent the God that we worship. It's a really, really beautiful thing. You want to know what a human is? That's what it is. That's who we are. We are images of God. It's definitive of us as creatures. And not only does he call us images of God, but then he gives us a task. And the task that he gives us is really interesting, because he says that we should have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over all creeping things that creep on the earth, over every land animal and everything. And he blesses these images and he says, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Okay, so that's the command. Part of our image of Godness is that we are supposed to have dominion over the world, subdue it, and be fruitful and multiply. So what was God doing in verses 1 through 25? He was subduing the earth, pulling out of it order, beauty, goodness, making the tohu, disorganized chaos, into beautiful order where life can flourish, and he was filling it. He was taking the vohu, the emptiness, and he was filling it. And then he creates his images, his representations, and he says to us, fill the earth and subdue it. Organize it. Fill the earth, subdue it. Fill the earth, have dominion over it. And so the very thing that God was doing in the beginning, he has now delegated that authority to his images. So Genesis chapter 1 is a story about how God creates the world and then delegates his authority over that world in terms of ordering it, beauty, goodness, making a good world even better, filling it even more with life and flourishing. And he takes that responsibility and he gives that to his images, to human beings. And so what does it mean to be a human? According to Genesis chapter 1, it means to be a representation of God and to be the representatives of God in this world. Part of our task is a royal task. We are made kings by God to rule over creation. But we are to rule in the way that he rules, because he gave us an example of what he does. He takes the chaos and the darkness and he pulls out order and beauty and goodness and he fills it with flourishing life. And so what are humans now supposed to do? We're supposed to rule the world, but in the character of God, right? Under his authority. We are supposed to continue to do the same thing, take a good world and make it even better. And one of the implications of this is that we have transformative powers. You think about human beings, and a lot of us think that we just kind of float through this world and we just sort of exist, but it's not true. And it doesn't actually take the Bible to tell us that that's not true. When humans enter into spaces, the spaces change, don't they? Have you ever come in contact with a human and built a relationship with another person and then left that relationship the same as you showed up? The answer is probably no. If you're maybe remember in college and you were doing a group project, or in high school you're doing a group project, and you had this group, and maybe you had this chemistry in this group, and someone else came in and everything changed. You think about playing sports. You have this team, and then maybe some people graduate, some new people come in, and everything changes. Why? Because humans are transformative beings. We're transformational. That's a responsibility that a lot of us haven't asked for, and that a lot of us don't want, but you don't have a choice. That's what it means to be a human. You enter into spaces, and the things that you touch and the places that you go are not the same as they were before you got there. That's humanity. That's what it means to be an image of God, to be a human. We've been given these transformational powers because we've been given a royal task as part of our image of God quality, to take God's good world and to make it even better. That's Genesis chapter 1. That's a beautiful story. That's a story that's rich with meaning, and it's rich with purpose, and it means that being a human is a serious thing, that we walk around this world and we've been given the tools to change the world because God has given us the mandate to change the world. We're supposed to exist in this world and live and interact with it in a way that takes his good creation and makes it even better. Image of God. It's what it means to be a human. And so, after that beautiful climactic moment of Genesis chapter 1, it says that thus the heavens and the earth were finished and the host of them, and on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. And so God blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy because on it God rested from his work that he had done in creation. And so the Sabbath is actually the climax of this story. Like, the human part is beautiful and it's amazing, but the Sabbath is essentially, the seventh day is what the world is supposed to be like. That we're supposed to rest in the presence of God. That doesn't necessarily mean do nothing. It means that we're supposed to rest in completeness. The world is as it should be. God is proximate with the humans in the garden. We're enjoying fellowship with him. We're enjoying relationship with him. And the world is beautiful, and it's ordered, and it's good, and life is flourishing. That's where the Sabbath tradition comes from. That's what we look forward to when we in the Jewish faith celebrate the Sabbath, the day when it shall be like this again. Because we're going to get into a part where all of this gets messed up. But before we do that, we get to Genesis chapter 2. And this is going to freak some people out a little bit, I think, because this isn't often the way that it's introduced to us, because it's kind of confusing. But this is actually a separate creation story. So theologically, it fits within the creation narrative. And it expresses some truths about what it means to be a human that were not yet expressed in Genesis chapter 1. And it adds some detail, and it adds some layers of things that were not yet expressed. And so it's important, but it is kind of a separate story. It sort of begins with a little bit of a different setting. This is actually where the garden is first called Eden, which is the Hebrew word for pleasure, right? Because when you live in God's good world, it's a pleasurable experience. It's a good place to be. So God has created this garden called Eden, and it says that there was no one to work the ground. And so God takes the dirt, which is the Hebrew word adamah, and he breathes into it and creates mankind. Adam. So Adam is created from dirt, adamah. And the formula in Genesis 2 for human is, dirt or earth or soil plus divine breath, right? And this is actually something that is it jives with our understanding of modern science, where like the world is just full of this organic material, but something's different about humans. And we call that something oftentimes consciousness, which there isn't a good scientific understanding of what that is or how that came to be. And so we say, okay, well, what's different about humans than the rest of the world is not really our organic matter. That's all, similar. Like it really is from the dust you come, from the dust you go. But there's something divine about being a human, about our consciousness, about our experience. There's something different. And according to Genesis chapter 2, it's divine breath, which jives with Genesis chapter 1 in terms of being an image of God, with being a representation of God. He's actually breathed this life into us. And so now in the garden, there is Adam. And he gives Adam this garden to enjoy. Every fruit tree that's in this orchard that he calls Eden is for Adam to enjoy. His job is to, like I said earlier, to keep the land and to work it, which is later what the priests of the Israelites are supposed to do in the temple. They keep and work the temple. And so Adam was the original priest of the world who was keeping and working the ground. It jives with Genesis chapter 1, rule, subdue the earth, have dominion over it, cultivate it, more beauty, more goodness, more order, take God's good world, and as his delegated representatives, bring more beauty, order, and goodness from it, take his good world and make it even better. Same idea, different poetic language to describe it. In verse 18, it says, God said that it's not good for man to be alone, and so I will make a helper fit for him. And none of the animals are proper helpers. And so Adam goes into a deep sleep, and God takes from his side and creates the woman. And this woman becomes the helper that's fit for Adam. Now, there's been a lot of bad theology that's come from our understanding of helper. And one of the things you have to understand is that translation is an inexact science. So the word, the Hebrew word in the scriptures for helper is ezer. And that word's used a lot in the scriptures. And it's oftentimes translated as helper. But you have to understand the context, because when we think of help or a helper, we kind of think of a subordinate who is helping, whoever the superior is. And a lot of patriarchal ideas have come from that, maybe even especially in the church world. A lot of kind of gender domination has come from that. But it's really doesn't really make sense in terms of the context of the scriptures, because that word ezer is used a lot in the scriptures. It's used a lot in the Hebrew Bible. And most of the time, it's referring to God himself. So, when it refers to God as the helper, is it saying that God is subordinate to who he's helping? Usually Israel, right? Israel's in a battle, and God is Israel's helper, ezer. Does that mean God is subordinate to the Israelite army, to Israel? Of course not. We just went through a whole thing about the creator-creature distinction, where God is the king of this world, and he's delegated his authority to us, which means that we are, in fact, his subordinates. And yet the scriptures often, most of the time, when it uses the word ezer, it refers to God. And then in terms of the context of the way that it's often referring to God in those other parts of the biblical story, it's referring to him in a militaristic sense, where God is Israel's helper militaristically, in terms of the military, in terms of strength and power and fighting and battle and succeeding. And so there is no subordination happening here. There is no subordinate, superior, inferior thing happening here. This is a story about how, in order to carry out the divine mandate to take God's good world and make it even better, it's difficult and it's a serious thing. And there's this beautiful partnership that's modeled here. And it's not a partnership of inferiority and superiority between male and female. It is a partnership of diversity within unity, which is what it means when it says, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. In verse 23, 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, or cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. And this is a model of marriage. Now, the theology of marriage is complicated, and so it doesn't mean that everybody has to be married in order to make it in this world, but it is a model of marriage. Even people who don't believe in the Christian idea of marriage, they still end up getting married, and they usually talk about it because of practical reasons, because of taxes, because of dual incomes, because of raising kids, because of stability, and none of those things are necessarily specifically related to this Christian model of marriage or this Jewish model of marriage. But, practicality is sort of what it makes me think of when it uses the word ezer, helper. Living in this world as a human is difficult. And oftentimes we need to unite with another person. Diversity within unity, male, female, relationship, marriage, commitment, one flesh, in order to go out into the world and to be and to do what God has commanded us to do. That's one of the reasons marriage is such a beautiful thing, and why the church celebrates it the way that it does. One flesh union of male and female, because the divine mandate to keep and work the garden is a difficult mandate to maintain. To take God's good world and to make it better requires us to unite with each other and help each other do that. And so here's where we are. God has organized and filled with life a chaotic, dark world that wasn't fit for the flourishing of life. And he created humans, and these humans are his representations of him. And then he gave them the task of doing exactly what he was doing before that, of organizing and cultivating and making the earth even more beautiful and filling it with even more life. That's the human mandate. And human beings are this image of God, this representation and these representatives of God, this divine organic matter filled with divine breath, who is overseeing the functioning of the world. That's Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And because that's what we're supposed to do, and because that's what we were created for, we have the power to do so. Think about human beings. If you just think about the way that nature works without human intervention, you might think of an apple on a tree, and that apple falls from the tree, and it hits the ground, and its seeds spill. And some of those seeds are going to get picked up by the wind, and maybe a couple of them plant over here, and you have more apple trees. And that's good. That's a good thing. But what if you put a human in charge of that apple tree? What could a human do? A human could take that apple tree and plant the seeds strategically and care for the soil and care for the ground and maybe even irrigate it with water to make sure that it's getting the nutrients that it needs. And now you have an apple orchard. And instead of a couple random trees that happened because an apple fell and the seed spilled, you now have an orchard of apples that could feed a village, that could feed a tribe. Good to very good. That's what human beings are supposed to do. Now, Genesis chapter 3, we get to the tragedy of the story. And all of a sudden, in Genesis chapter 3, a snake shows up, and the snake is talking, which is very strange. Don't see that very often. And where did the snake come from? I don't remember anybody talking about a snake, or the fact that a snake was craftier than all of the other beasts of the field. And the Bible doesn't say. There's systematic theology that you can try to pull out of it, but the Bible doesn't really say where the snake came from or why the snake's there or why God allows a deceiver to come into the garden and speak with his people when he is in their presence. It doesn't say why. And sometimes that happens in the Bible. You have questions and it doesn't answer it. And that's just the way that it is. This is what God has given us. This is what he's revealed to us. And so the snake comes into the garden and he says to the woman, now did God actually say, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? Which is an interesting thing for us to ponder, because a lot of times when we think about a lie, we think about you just making something up, right? Sometimes people do that, and sometimes that happens where you just make stuff up, and that's kind of the way that we typically think about a lie. But you have to understand that what's interesting about this is that this is the temptation of mankind. And what the snake does in his temptation is he doesn't make something up. He takes something that God did say, and he just kind of twists it a little bit. He just kind of turns it a little bit. He makes it a little bit of a half-truth. Oftentimes, the most effective lies have a lot of truth in them. God did say there's a tree you're not allowed to eat from. He didn't say you're not allowed to eat from any tree. And so there's kind of this conflation of you can eat from any tree but not this tree with you can't eat from any tree. So humans see that, and she says, no, we may eat from the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat from the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, you surely will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And so Eve actually answers correctly. She says, no, that's not true. Actually, he said we could eat from the trees, but we can't eat from that tree. But it's almost like the deception has kind of knocked her off balance a little bit, where it's like, enjoy this garden, enjoy this beauty. You can have anything you want. You can eat from any tree, but you can't eat from that tree. And then someone points out that you can't eat from that tree, the forbidden fruit. And Eve's like, no, I guess we are allowed to eat from any tree, but we can't eat from that tree because he says we'll die. And the snake says, no, you won't die. Your eyes will be opened, and you'll become like God. Now think about the tragedy of this, because she takes the fruit and she eats it. And the promise is that she's going to become like God. But what did we just spend half an hour talking about a second ago? Who is Eve? She's an image of God. She's a representation that has become a representative of him, that's been given divine breath and power to do exactly what God already did in this world. And so she eats the fruit because she wants to be like God. She already is. She's not God, but she's already like him. And so she eats the fruit, and she gives some to Adam, and he eats the fruit. And their eyes were opened, and they both knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together, and they made themselves loincloths. So they were naked and unashamed. They eat the fruit. Their eyes are opened, and they cover themselves in shame. Now, what is going on here? Like, what's the meaning of this? Because this is kind of a confusing sequence of events. Like, there's the tree of life, there's all these fruit trees, they can eat from any of them, but they can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why not? What's the problem with that tree? What is it about that tree that the serpent says is going to make them like God? What is it about that tree that opens their eyes and brings them shame? When you think about an ancient context that this was written in, it's often written in the context of kings. And you think about what a king was allowed to do. And that's autocratic rulership. That's authoritarianism. So who's allowed to make the rules? Who's allowed to break the rules? Who's allowed in a culture to define what's right and wrong in this context? The answer is the king. And so the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, humans shall not eat from that tree. I think one of the things this is getting at is this is a question of kingship. Who's the king? Who gets to define right and wrong? Is it you or is it God? Is God the king or are you the king? When Eve eats the apple, that's why it's called a rebellion, because she is effectively saying, we're the king. We're going to rule the world with the divine powers that God has given us. But instead of doing it on God's behalf, in his name and in his character, we're going to do it on our own behalf, in our own names, in our own character. We will define what's right and wrong. We will define what's good and evil. So they eat the fruit, and everything changes. John Milton in Paradise Lost says that when Eve eats the fruit, creation sighs, because everything has changed. God's images, who have been given the mandate and the power to rule the world on God's behalf, have now decided to take that power, to take that responsibility, and to rule the world on their own behalf, in their own names, as their own definers of good and evil. And so the question is, okay, so now reality has changed. How's it going to go? How's it going to go? It's already brought shame into their lives, right? Because they cover themselves in leaves, and then in verse 8, God comes walking in the cool of the day, looking for them. So God seeks them out, and what do? They hide from it. So they become ashamed, and then they hide from God, and then he finds them, and they said that they were hiding from him because they were naked, because they were ashamed. He says, well, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat? And the man says, yes, she gave it to me. So immediately blames the woman, and the woman says, well, the snake told me to do it. And so there's shame, and then they're hiding from the presence of God, and then there's kind of a confession, but within that confession there's blame. It's your fault, it's his fault, it's their fault. And when I say that this story is true, I mean it. Because think about the world, and think about the brokenness, and think about how this is the sequence of events. There's us ruling the world on our own behalf, deciding for ourselves what's right and wrong, being our own gods, being our own kings, and it results in shame. It results in distance from God, and it results in catastrophic events in which we tend to blame everybody else. How many incidents in the world have happened that you would call an atrocity, and the committer of that atrocity says, you're right, it is solely my fault. It's no one else's fault. It doesn't happen, right? When we commit acts like this is what we do. When we sin, this is what we do. We find shame, we pass the blame, we hide from God. This story is just so perfectly encapsulates the human experience in terms of sin and brokenness and the results thereof. And so God, the first thing that he does, and you have to understand this because this is actually important theologically, and it just kind of seems like a sequencing thing, but this is important. The first thing he does is he curses the serpent. He says, you will be cursed above all other beasts, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And so that's a very confusing, poetic, linguistically complicated thing here in the original language. But what's important theologically is that before God curses man, before anyone is punished, he curses the serpent, the deceiver, the one that we will come to call Satan. And not only does he curse him, but he promises deliverance. And he says, one day there will be an offspring from the woman who will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. And as Christians, we believe that's Jesus, and the cross is a picture of that. But in terms of God, sometimes there's this idea that God is gracious in the New Testament, but he was mean in the Old Testament, and it's much more complicated than that. That's not true. God is gracious all the time. God is compassionate and long-suffering all the time. And here's an example of this. The original sin, the sin that sets the world into a trajectory of catastrophe, and God's response is to curse the deceiver and promise deliverance for the people. But of course, there are consequences to the people. There are consequences for the woman. One of those consequences, in my opinion, and this is an interpretive controversy, one of the controversies of the fall, one of the consequences of the fall is that your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And so in the history of the world, there is this relationship between male and female that is almost exclusively characterized as patriarchal, where the male is kind of ruling with might is right over the female. Now, this has gone through iterations and changes, and it looks different, and there was the feminist movement, and modern science has taught us a lot about the male-female dichotomy. There's in the modernized world, the Western world specifically, much of the work that we do is no longer strength-based, which is probably where males may have a physical advantage. And so in terms of the importance of male and female, that's all changed. Gender dynamics is different now. But through the history of the world, patriarchy has been the name of the game, and today it still is. I mean, just look at how many CEOs are males and how many are females. How many college presidents are males and how many are females. How many whatever. That's still the name of the game in some way. In my opinion, interpretively speaking, is that uneven relationship is actually a consequence of the fall, which means that it's not how it ought to be, which means that as Christians, part of living after the cross and the resurrection is we're supposed to bring the way that things ought to be into the present. It means that our lives and our relationships ought to be characterized by the equality that was broken in the fall. And so that's an interesting thing for people to chew on if you're interested. He curses Adam, says it's going to be very difficult for you to live in this world. The ground is not going to do what you want. You just think about, nature, there's droughts, there's going to be storms. It's going to be difficult for you to be the gardener that I created you to be. It's going to be more difficult for you to cultivate order and beauty and goodness out of this earth than it would have been before. And ultimately, you will die. Death is introduced. The tree of life, symbolically speaking, in the ancient world, because it's not exclusive to the Hebrew, Jewish, Israelite tradition. The tree of life is supposed to be the symbol of the divine gift of eternity. The divine gift of immortality. That, according to the scriptures, if things were the way that they were supposed to be, there would be no death. But because of the fact that God's vice regents, his vice rulers, his delegated authorities have ruled the world on their own behalf instead of on behalf of God, and have twisted this, the way that things are supposed to be, into a way that it's not supposed to be. One of the consequences of that, perhaps the ultimate consequence of that, is death, which is why the climax of the story of the scriptures is the resurrection of Jesus, the defeat of death. And lastly, and most importantly, the consequence of the fall is that the humans are expelled out of the Garden of Eden, which is where the presence of God dwells. One of the things that we were created for was intimate communion with God. And one of the results of sin is we are taken away from the tree of life, which means that we die, and we are taken outside of the garden, which means outside of the intimate, immediate presence of God as we were supposed to be. And that will continue to be a theme in this story, and that's the fall. And so Genesis chapter 1 through 3 is really, really important, because the rest of the story of the scriptures is taking the way that things are after the fall and trying to bring them back into the way that things were in the seventh day, in the Sabbath, in that rest where all things were right and humans were what they were supposed to be, which is the delegated authorities, the rulers of this world ruling on God's behalf, taking a good world and making it even better. And so this is some interesting stuff to ponder. Next video that we make will be over probably 4 through 8, maybe 4 through the flood, and it's going to talk about a lot of the consequences of sinful humanity. And this is an important thing for us as Christians to realize, because one of the things that the Bible is not really saying is that because we're sinful, that means we've broken a rule, and we should be ashamed of the fact that we've broken a rule, and we should just try to stop breaking rules. What the Bible's saying is much more intense than that. What the Bible's saying is that when we do not live according to God, when we do not live according to Him being the king, when we make ourselves the king, the consequences are tragic. Death is introduced, shame is introduced. We are exiled away from His presence, the very thing that we were created to be in. The world becomes a difficult place to live in. And we're going to see some even more dire consequences as violence and war is introduced through the next few chapters, that ultimately, because we have the power to make the world as God's images, because we have the power to create all of this order and beauty and goodness, if we misuse that power, if we abuse that power, we also have the ability to decreate the world. We have the ability to undo it. We have the ability to take the thing that we're supposed to make better and make it much, much worse. And that's not to create shame in us. That's to understand the context of the world that we live in. You look around you, man, this is not the way that things are supposed to be. You see the death, you see the violence, you see the war, you see the tension. It's not how things are supposed to be. It's the way that things are. According to the scriptures, this is why. Because we, as humans, are very, very powerful. We have the creative power of God in our bones. We have the ability to take a world and transform it. And because we have that ability, we can choose to make ourselves the king. And the consequences of that are we will use those transformative powers to decreate the world and create the very thing that the very opposite of the thing we were supposed to create, which is violence and chaos and disorder. And that's the beginning of the story. Now, remember, in the midst of that kind of dark, like, whoa, what is the status of humanity? How can God go on in this creation project if these are His images and these are His delegated authorities and these are His vice? Like, how can all this work? Remember, in Genesis 3:15, right after the fall, one of God's first responses was to not only seek after humans, but then to promise deliverance. So there's a promise in here, 3:15. And that promise is going to be a significant piece of the rest of the story. And so that's a little bit of a deeper dive with a little bit of original language and a little bit of broader theological connections, and hope that that's helpful. And I'm excited to be doing this with you, and we will see you guys next time as we go through Genesis 4 through Genesis 8. Thanks, guys.